Hillary.
Got it. Yes, again, thank you so much for having me here. So as a basis for our discussion, I thought I'd offer a bit of an alternative perspective on DeFi. I've done a lot of research on this space, and my findings are a little bit inconsistent with some of the descriptions we've heard. So I just thought I'd offer those as an alternative or a complement to our discussion. So I think it's important to recognize the difference between technological decentralization and economic decentralization. So most of the what we're seeing in the DeFi space is technological decentralization. And this relates actually to the comment just made, which is that's all well and good, but if you have economic centralization behind it, you lose the benefits of the technological centralization. And that, I think, is very much what we see in the DeFi space at the moment. We see intense economic concentration. Holders of governance tokens in DAOs are very, very concentrated. And then there's a lot of other centralized intermediaries. We heard about the oracles, the data feeds. Those are often centralized data sources, et cetera. So this space is not economically decentralized in any sense, to my mind. And that's helpful from a regulatory perspective because that means there are people to regulate. We talk about the code, et cetera. The code doesn't fall like manna from heaven. The code is programmed by people. And again, these are people we can regulate. And we shouldn't forget that the failure that kicked off the whole series of crypto failures last year was Terra Luna, which was technologically decentralized, albeit very economically centralized in the hands of Do Kwon. So I just want to sort of offer that as a baseline because we go to a lot of effort in DeFi to get the technological decentralization, and it causes all kinds of problems in terms of scaling problems, et cetera. So there are a lot of challenges. It's basically, in order to achieve a technological decentralization, you effectively need a more inefficient mechanism than a centralized version, because that's the only way decentralization works. So we're picking inefficiency if we're going with underlying decentralized technology. And so we need to think about that in the context of the fact that technological decentralization is then often overruled by underlying economic decentralization. So I just wanted to sort of throw that into the mix as we have this discussion.
Dan.
Hey, thanks. Dan Guido, CEO of TrailBits. As we're talking about the decentralized nature of these platforms, I feel compelled to point out that at the behest of DARPA last year, TrailBits undertook a comprehensive study of the unintended centralities of distributed ledgers and published all our findings in a repeatable manner on the internet. You can find that report. It's Are Blockchains Decentralized? Unintended Centralities in Distributed Ledgers. We discussed a large number of different types of unintended centralities that cover a lot of what Hillary said and more. And it includes empirical data that, again, is reproducible based on our observed state of many of the most popular blockchains that are available right now. And the findings are, I think, align with Hillary's statements that there is significant unintended centralities that the privileged set of entities that exist in this industry are numerous, and the opportunity to manipulate the operation of these blockchains by co-opting them is quite high. So I'll let folks search for that report and grab it.
Presentation regarding DeFi issues. We have Dan Guido, founder and CEO of Trail of Bits, and Michael Shaloff, founder and CEO of Fireblocks, will present on the topic of exploits and continuing vulnerabilities in crypto markets. Dan will go first, followed by Michael.
Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Dan Guido, the CEO of TrailBits. I want to briefly introduce ourselves. So I founded TrailBits 10 years ago with the aim to solve the hardest problems in software security. We really believe that we need better tools in order to overcome the challenges at hand, that just best practices are not enough. Over the last 10 years, we've grown the team to about 140 research engineers that are solely focused on these emerging technologies, of which blockchain is one. We work with people across national security, DoD, DARPA, the tech industry. We've worked with companies like Microsoft, Google, Zoom, Epic Games, and we've worked with pretty much half the blockchain industry. We have unprecedented visibility into the internal operations and the production of code that occurs in the blockchain industry. And just, I have to give credit where credit's due. I had my education paid for by the National Science Foundation through their CyberCore program. And very happy to be continuing in public service here. So next slide. So one thing that I wanted to make clear is that there is obviously a perception in the industry that no one can get it right, that everything gets hacked every single day. There's 2 or 3 companies that are completely obliterated by hacks in the blockchain industry, and it's completely overrun with scams, and that security must be an afterthought. These must be the worst possible things that have ever been created, and that's why they're getting hacked. But in reality, I see something different in the everyday practice of Trail of Bits. The blockchain clients that we have are actually the most rapid at incorporating the techniques and the guidance that we give them. They demand it from us. We will beat them up, and they will ask us to hit them harder. It is, however, very difficult for them to understand what they should do. There's an obvious dearth of security expertise across the entire technology industry, but it hits the blockchain industry even harder because the foundations of the field change every day. The kinds of problems that we solved, the kinds of technology that we built in blockchain is different today than it was 6 months ago, than it was a year ago, than it was 2 years ago. And in order to secure yourself, you need to be perfectly up to date. And then finally, there's not a lot of information that you can trust. A lot of blockchain firms themselves, as well as fans of them, spread a lot of information that is more marketing and aspiration than it is empirical truth. So that's part of what I'd like to bring to this conversation today, is some empirical truth about what we see on the ground, having performed hundreds, if not thousands, of security audits of these firms. So next slide. So the first thing to recognize that's really unique about this field is that it moves far, far faster than on a technological underpinning than any other field of software. This can make it extremely difficult for standards and practices to apply, because if you're using 6 months ago's standards, it is completely insufficient to protect you today. So I've got some examples up here. Before 2020, we actually released an authoritative work of trends that we observed for all the audits that we looked at. It was 246 findings, and tried to determine what are the issues that people have trouble with. That study was conducted again in the last year by a different research lab, and the kinds of security issues that affect firms have completely changed. DeFi is now present. The introduction of flash loans changed the risk calculus for a lot of these firms. We're looking at Oracle manipulation, composability bugs. These things simply did not exist a year or 2 ago. So this has implications for the way that we compose standards and guidance for these firms. Things like NIST CSF, SOC 2, PCI, they're all very high level, and the ones that are very low level obviously are going to become outdated immediately. The ones that are very high level aren't going to specifically address the kinds of flaws that these firms need to protect themselves against. Next slide. Now, another unique dynamic of this field is that information is public and platforms are shared. In the regular software industry, and in DC particularly, we've had lots of conversation about building an NTSB for software, for cyber, for technology. And that already exists here. All of these transactions that occur on the blockchain, all of the hacks, they are extraordinarily public, and it's usually your users and other outside firms that find out about them before you do. So this inverted view on what's secret, it's really, it influences a need for perfection from these firms. You have to take very careful steps forward in order to assure the safety of what you've built, because everybody is watching. So on the right here, we have one of these sort of NTSBs for safety, the Rect Leaderboard, which is a public collection of memorialized firms that have either been completely knocked out or partially knocked out based on hacks. And many of them have a word next to them, unaudited, which means that they didn't actually seek outside guidance for whatever changes they made before they made them. So again, highlighting the fact that an extraordinary amount of expertise is required in order to build these systems safely. And the firms that don't know that and don't live by that end up getting wrecked. I guess one other really interesting note here is that in the latest Biden executive order on cybersecurity, we talked about cyber liability, that firms should be liable for the sorts of issues that they produce for the world. That's already here in blockchain too. These hacks have a direct impact on the finances of these firms, on their governance tokens, on their treasuries that are rated. So in fact, they are more motivated. They have not externalized the costs. The costs are internalized for these failures, which kind of drives the reason why these people are so rapidly consuming guidance from firms like mine, in contrast to a lot of other clients that we might have where the dynamic is different. Okay, next slide. So finally, all of this really influences the need for perfection. Where a lot of other industries can get by with risk mitigation, this field needs risk elimination. You cannot ignore vulnerabilities that were given to you that are simply low severity, right? Everything is high severity. For instance, and this also creates issues with these standards yet again. You wouldn't ask NASA to build the software in its rockets that are going up to space with only the NIST CSF, right? That is what the blockchain needs. The blockchain needs software that is built to precise specifications that always operates the right way. That level of correctness is really not commonly achieved. It really is never achieved by anybody else building software right now. This is what we'd call high assurance software. This is the kind of thing you need to do when you're building rockets, when you're launching things into space, when you're building cryptographic libraries, or working with software that mediates the life and death of a person. So I see that, clearly there's a dearth of expertise in this field. There's not enough security experts to get the job done. A lot of people might look at AI as a potential solution to this issue, but that is not the right thing to use. AI, as I've said here, is a paintbrush, and we need a scalpel. We need things that are precise and algorithmic, not probabilistic. So really, all of this points to the field needs more research, needs more work, more innovation done to figure out how to secure these systems, because they've chosen to try to scale the tallest mountain we have in software security, and to do it all right now. After decades worth of study in computer science, we still don't have a lot of methods and techniques and tools available to us to properly meet the bar that we have set. However, there are things we can do right now that we know have to be done in order to get there. So next slide. So yeah, just to reiterate some key issues here, that blockchain companies are actually motivated to fix security issues, and they are some of the most security conscious organizations we have ever worked with. The underlying foundation of the field changes rapidly, and the technology solutions and guidance that you give people 6 months ago sometimes doesn't apply today. The public nature of these chains and of the hacks that occur is an extraordinary opportunity to learn, both for us, but also for attackers. So there's extraordinary systemic risk when new attack methods are identified or when new risks are identified, that they become exploited by actual attackers within hours. And it can affect the entire ecosystem. And that, we really need to improve on research and innovation here, that best practices are necessary, but not sufficient to solve the problem that we've got. So with that in mind, we do have several things, next slide, that I would like to highlight are extraordinarily important for everyone to meet. This is kind of what we use as one of our internal standards of, are you doing the right things to keep your blockchain protocol safe? We developed this in partnership with a number of other firms at a recent conference that I believe some people in the room may have been at. But these are 12 critical security controls that I think an amateur or an outsider or an interested party or a regulator, a venture investor, a user can have a conversation with, a productive conversation with a blockchain protocol to determine if they are doing the right things to keep their data safe. This is, again, it's not comprehensive. If you can answer all of these questions, it still is not enough, but having a written and tested incident response plan, there's not a world in which that's not a necessity. Next slide. I'd like to offer up a couple resources that our company has produced to help further this conversation and add to the safety and security of these systems. That RecTest has a blog of its own. I mentioned a paper that we've described about blockchain decentralization, the empirical data from our audits, as well as the huge number of open source tools and best practices that we've been able to put out there to help companies do this job well. In addition to, which I forgot to mention, a new AI safety team where we're repeating the same process of building out the security foundations of a field as it's emerging. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Michael, who knows a lot about this topic as well.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. And maybe we can switch to presentation. Okay, so thanks so much for having me here. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to essentially kind of build up from where Dan walk us through and give 3 practical examples of actually real-world hacks that happened in the last 18 months. And the reason is that because we sort of kind of diving deep into 3 core issues that I think cover, I wouldn't probably say 100%, but 90% of the issues that we see across all the hacks that are on the website that you guys saw before. So just a quick introduction about us. We provide secure infrastructure for financial institutions and Web3 companies. In the space, we have a pretty large client base of 1,800 clients that we are servicing. And before actually starting Fireblocks, I spent 2 decades of my career in cybersecurity. And the last thing that actually led us to starting Fireblocks was that we investigated a breach that happened in South Korea across multiple exchanges back in 2017. So I think that actually looking into some of those hacks gives a pretty good insight of what's going on and what we need to be focusing on. And next slide. So the 3 hacks that I want to kind of review is, the first one is basically the hack that happened with Ronin. It was brought up earlier by Ari in his presentation, and that's a hack that is related to key management and private key security. The second one is that with Badger DAO, which is a man-in-the-middle attack and related to transaction security. And the last one is something we discussed quite extensively so far, is with a protocol called Euler Finance, where this was a smart contract hack. So let's start from the first one, and I'll provide a bit of a setup and explain what that company was doing and then essentially what failed. So Ronin is actually a blockchain that is underpinning a game that was the most popular NFT game called Axie Infinity. It was operated by a company called Sky Mavis. And in order for you to play that game, you had to basically transfer some value into the Ronin blockchain. The Ronin blockchain was effectively a fork, or basically a copy of the Ethereum blockchain that was used for more high-performance capabilities across that game. And that bridge is, the bridge that was operated is what allowed consumers to basically take their Ethereum coins or take USDC and essentially replicate on the Ronin blockchain. So the way that it was actually operating, without getting into the real deep technical details, is that there was an address, there was basically an account on the Ethereum blockchain that if you wanted to play the game as a user that had some Ethereum coins, you could basically put it into that account, and then the Ronin bridge was basically mirroring those assets on the other blockchain. The way that the bridge was operated, basically Sky Mavis wanted to make sure that it's somewhat, I guess, like a federated approach, not exactly decentralized, but it's not a centralized issue. There are a bunch of validators, which are effectively just servers. And those servers, each one of them has a private key that is required to sign transactions for deposit and withdraw those coins. And the way that the structure worked is that there were 9 different validators. 5 of them was operated by Sky Mavis, another 5 by different actors, and you had to have a signature of 5 of them out of the 9 to basically withdraw assets. Now, if we go to the next slide, what happened to specifically to Sky Mavis is actually a very typical spear phishing attack, which we've seen in the cybersecurity industry for the last, I guess, decade and a half. And I think the attribution for this attack goes to Lazarus Group that was mentioned earlier. They're affiliated with North Korea, and in March. And basically on March 23rd, they were able to withdraw $650 million worth of cryptocurrency from that bridge. The way that the attack unfolded, or the forensics, was that what the hackers were able to do is to convince an IT engineer, a DevOps engineer that worked for Sky Mavis, to go through a fake interview process for a different blockchain company. Through that interview process, he actually received an assignment, and they basically send him a malicious PDF file that he downloaded to his computer. That malicious PDF file contained the malware. Once they were basically on the computer of the IT professional, they were able to traverse across all the different servers where they had the private keys for the bridge. And because of some misconfiguration that happened a few months earlier, they were able to also traverse into another validator and effectively collect 5 private keys, right, that were sufficient to control the bridge and to withdraw the $650 million worth of funds. Something that I will actually mention about this specific attack is that we see a lot of those examples around private key management where companies are essentially creating bespoke systems to do that, and they come up with their own practices of how to do key management, although today we have probably a large set of institutional and non-institutional providers that have been doing it for a few years already, and that underpins a good chunk of the hacks. Now let's go to the next slide to basically discuss the Badger DAO. So the Badger is basically a decentralized application that what it does, it basically allows users to generate yield on Bitcoin using a variety of decentralized strategies. And actually, the decentralized app is working just fine, but in order for you to access a decentralized application, the most convenient way to do it is through a web application that is provided in kind of Web 2 or Web 1 fashion, in which I'm, as a user, just going with my web browser into an HTTPS domain, and something HTML file is being loaded on my computer. Specifically, Badger, like many other projects in the blockchain, and generally speaking in tech, and I think broadly in the IT industry, use a service called Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a very popular CDN and anti-DDoS service, similar to Akamai for those who are familiar with, and this is essentially a service which is a centralized service that is sitting in front of the website and allows them to protect themselves from DDoS attacks and also to accelerate the content to their users. What happened to Badger, if we go to the next slide, which is quite interesting, is that at some point their credentials to control their Cloudflare account were compromised. So basically there was a group of hackers that were able to go and modify the configuration of Cloudflare for specifically the Badger interface. And what was happening, if you were the user of Badger, right, you wanted to deploy your Bitcoin over there, instead of you kind of loading into your web browser the content, the HTML pages from Badger, the content was manipulated by the hackers that were sitting in between you and Badger on the Cloudflare layer, right? So what the hackers cleverly were able to do is that they were able to insert code that manipulated you as a user to sign a transaction that pre-authorized what we call an approved transaction in DeFi. It basically pre-authorized your wallet to send assets in a future date to an address that is controlled by the hackers and the attackers. And they actually orchestrated this attack for about 2 weeks, going unnoticed. So they created the pre-authorization across many, many different wallets. And then in a single day, they basically withdrew all the funds that were in that wallet, in those wallets, and were able to harvest $120 million worth of assets. That's basically a pretty interesting attack, because what it actually did, it basically diverted transactions from the users, and as probably most people here are already familiar with, there is no recourse, right, for most of those funds, and therefore the assets were gone to the hackers' wallets. And that goes actually to the point that Dan made, is like that it's not sufficient always to deploy fraud controls that are operating like in traditional finance, where you can analyze what is going on, and then maybe try to revert some transactions. You actually need to eliminate some of those vulnerabilities from the very beginning. Now, if we skip to the next slide, I want to probably focus on maybe the most complicated part of DeFi security, and that's basically attacks that are operating on the smart contract level itself. So another DeFi protocol called Euler Finance, they have a pretty broad, broad suite of services. They allow you to do decentralized trading. They allow you to do decentralized lending and borrowing. And one of the interesting things is that they allow you to basically trade 10x, basically a 10x leverage on the collateral that you deposit. So without going into the specifics of how their protocol actually operates, if we go to the next slide, what happened a week ago on March 13th or 14th was that they had a logical bug in terms of how they were attributing collateral vs debt, right? And through a sequence of fairly complicated financial transactions that included flash loans, leverage borrowing, and some deposits back into the protocol, the attacker was able to create a mismatch between what were the actual, what was basically the leverage vis-a-vis the collateral that was in the protocol. And therefore, when they were able to trigger a liquidation, but that liquidation not only basically took their position, that liquidation actually gone into all the positions of all the other users on the protocol, and they were essentially able to withdraw then most of the collateral that was sitting in that protocol, making a profit of $200 million, right? And that was something which is not, the real complicated thing over here is that this is actually not an attack that we are familiar with from, I would say, traditional IT cybersecurity. This sits somewhere in the middle of a cybersecurity issue and real financial manipulation of a protocol. And because those protocols are effectively operating like a financial contract, there is no way for you to reverse back the result. So that basically covers, I think, sort of the technical details of 3 different case studies. If we go to just the next slide. And what I think that is interesting is that the industry is currently situated in a fairly mature state in terms of both key management and transaction security, where there are good examples of how this is being done. And maybe in those areas, we are already at the maturity where we can put some policies and best practices. Definitely on the kind of last example of smart contracts, it's still an ongoing research. There is a lot of debate of what are the best approaches to tackle the challenges over there. And over there, we just need to continue with the research, put some best practices, my opinion, and continue sort of evolving how security is being done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I'm Dan Guido from Trail of Bits. I wanted to make a point to just highlight the extreme level of technical challenge that folks like Espresso Systems and other people doing work in the zero-knowledge and privacy-preserving cryptography space are underneath. This field is completely unstandardized, yet it underpins a lot of the key features that are required to make things like digital identity and what else the folks from Paradigm just described. These are, there aren't verifiably good implementations of them, and a lot of times when people are trying to build them, they have to go back to the original papers as they were written by academics in the 80s, 70s, 60s, who weren't aware of how we would be trying to use them today. So we found a number of vulnerabilities in these systems at Trail of Bits, and I've had to report them to others, where people have actually just straight up followed what are in these academic papers to the letter, but some of the descriptions of them in the papers themselves have been broken. So there's really like an extraordinary amount of technical expertise required to build privacy-preserving encryption systems that are defensible, that are reliable, that are resilient against attacks. We've made a small contribution here in the absence of that standardization. Trail of Bits published a resource called zkdocs.com that prescribes known good solutions for actually implementing these technologies to make it easier for people. But just really wanted to highlight that these are research systems that now we have put into public practice, and it feels like a lot of people are sort of dancing on the lip of a volcano when it comes to using them to safeguard the privacy of others.
Thank you, Dan, and I appreciate the insights and look forward to your presentation in a moment. Dan Guido.
One thing that I'd like to point out is that with a lot of the generative AI systems that have popped up, they operate in very unconstrained manners. Like you can ask ChatGPT to be a lawyer, a doctor, you can ask it to review a cancer scan of you, you can do a million different things with it. So it's very hard to figure out, is this thing fit for purpose? What is it supposed to do? If there's no like use case defined or specifications that it operates against, it's very hard for an outsider to evaluate whether it actually meets the goals that we've set out for it. So from an assessment perspective, one technique that we find very valuable at Trail of Bits is the use of something that the self-driving car folks came up with called an operational design domain, or an ODD. And with an ODD, you're able to define what is this system intended to be used for, and then measure its performance against those goals. So while the risk management framework from NIST is an excellent contribution to the space, and the Bill of Rights is an excellent contribution to the space, from a risk assessment perspective rather than a risk management perspective, I think ODDs are a positive contribution.